Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may find yourself from the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. My name is Harry Verhoeven. I'm with the Center in the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. It's my great pleasure to welcome you for this panel focused on Southern Africa and questions of water security or insecurity, hydropower, and the law. And we've got an absolutely fantastic panel for you here today. But before we turn to that, I'll just make a few quick housekeeping announcements. The first is, of course, that this event is open to the public. It's being live streamed. It's open to the press. Important for you to be aware of all of these things. And as always, we'll first hear from our speakers. We'll then also have a discussant who'll come back with a number of comments on what he's heard from our different panelists. And then we'll open it up to you. As always, you can write down your questions in the chat so that we can see them, we'll then group a number of those questions together and put them to our panelists. We encourage you to engage as much as you want with one another, as well as with our panelists there today. As I said, we tackle today the questions of water security, insecurity, hydropower, and law in Southern Africa. Southern Africa, of course, a region with quite a number of specific characteristics that make it different from other parts of the continent. This event forms part of our larger series that we have on African perspectives on climate and climate adaptation. And what we hope to do today is to indeed highlight some of the specificities of the challenges, historically as well as today, as well as going forward into the future in Southern Africa. Southern Africa, of course, a region of the continent that has long been very reliant on agriculture, on hydrocarbons, and on mining. But of course, where recently quite a number of questions have arisen about the sustainability of hydro infrastructures and the ways in which a lot of that infrastructure has perpetuated different types of inequalities over many years, over many generations even. And the question, of course, is what we can do about those. Now, for the panel today, we draw on quite a number of the contributors to a special issue, which I had the great privilege of editing, of Daedalus, the Journal of the American Academy of the Arts and Sciences, which essentially focused on water security in Africa in an age of global climate change. I'll put the link in the chat in just a bit so that people can read some of the contributions there. It's open access, so hopefully that should be possible for all of you to follow some of the arguments made here today in written form over there. What we'll do is we'll start off with Professor Heinz Klug from University of Wisconsin-Madison, who'll start us off. We'll then have two other contributors to the special issue, Dr. Mucha Msemwa and Dr. Kate Brown, respectively of the University of the Witwatersrand and the University of the Western Cape, come in with their thoughts and their contributions. And then as a discussant, we have the great privilege of having my good friend, Professor Simukar Chigudu of the University of Oxford, to round us off before, as I said, we open it up to you. But let me now first invite Heinz to switch on his camera and to make a number of opening remarks about his contribution, his thoughts on the general subject. Heinz, great pleasure to have you here with us today. Thank you so much for joining us for the discussion.
Great, Harry. Thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm very happy to participate. I just arrived back in the US from Johannesburg just day before yesterday, Saturday night late. And, you know, the thing about Southern Africa, of course, is that we're very aware that's an area of enormous historical droughts and water shortage. And the only surprising thing over the last week that I was in Johannesburg, it rained every day. And so that kind of, that constant change and insecurity with respect to access to water is real, even when it's raining as it is right now. I want to talk today briefly about the relationship between, and in very broad terms, between the advocacy of principles, law, and the problem of water, problem of power in the governance of water. I want to begin by making clear that my approach to these issues comes from my own experience serving as an advisor to Kada Asmal, then the Minister of Water Affairs and Forestry in Nelson Mandela's government. And I'd got to know Kada Asmal working in the ANC Constitutional Committee during the transition to democracy in South Africa. The reason I make this background clear is because the importance of the idea of principles as a means of opening and guiding conflict is in this case, and in this case about access to water, I will argue is embedded in this broader history of the use of principles in the transition from apartheid in South Africa. In a broader context, I will argue my article that struggles over water resources in Southern Africa occur within three broad frames: an institutional frame, a hydrological frame, and an ideological frame. And if you think of those three, when we think about the institutional, it really focuses on the questions of capacity of implementation. While if you think of hydrological, there you're really talking about trying to bring in the kind of scientific understanding of water, which historically, of course, has changed quite dramatically and very importantly in this particular context. And finally, the question of the ideological, the struggle that goes on right through this period between a human rights approach to access to water and neoliberalism, and how these were both implicated at the same time in these debates. It is within each of these frames that the advocacy of principles initially enabled significant change to the existing legal framework for the allocation of water resources. You had a framework that was based on the colonial dispossession of land, the introduction of a riparian system of rights, so rights to land that were colonially constructed, then provided rights to water. And these could not be pulled apart without challenging the very way in which water, the allocation and understanding of access to water was understood in that colonial context. So while principles were key to the challenge of the established structures of power, and particularly the hydrological principles, so if once we were able to say there's a very different understanding of the water cycle as a whole than what the previous law had been based upon, we were able to undermine the existing structures of power with respect to water and say the only way forward was to reinvent them, to re-establish them. And it was interesting how, given the changing hydrological understanding, there was much less resistance to water law reform than there has been to many other forms of reform in South Africa. And that really was a key element to that. Now, while principles were key to challenging these established structures of power, it is the reassertion of power within both the ideological and institutional frames that I would argue today presents the greatest challenge to the governance of water in South Africa. Now, this idea of principles as a means to address irreconcilable conflicts, especially in the context of constitutional conflict, of course, is not new. However, in Southern Africa, the use of principles was first highlighted by the Western Contact Group in the UN in their relationship to the question of Namibian independence. And that was done in the mid-1980s. And the African National Congress took up this example when it issued its constitutional principles in 1988 as a means of foreclosing the apartheid regime's use of limited reform to break out of its international isolation. And so this use of principles provides both guidelines and constructive ambiguity, also facilitated the democratic transition in South Africa. So if you look at the 1993 interim constitution, it contained 34 principles that were to guide the democratically elected Constitutional Assembly, and continues today in the final 1996 constitution's founding provisions, which are based on principles and values. So the power of this idea of principles was inherent in the democratic transition, picked up in that. And that is exactly what Kara Asmal then reaches out to as we start the water reform process. And for instance, if we think about that a little further, it's significant for today's conversation because the idea of principles and values, of course, was also central to the World Commission on Dams that Kara Asmal chaired between 1998 and 2000. And if you think of the core values that that commission then propagates for addressing these areas, values of equity, efficiency, participatory decision-making, sustainability, accountability, these are the values that then are used to produce guidelines for the sustainable development of large dams. The problem, the difficulty with this, all of this, is, of course, that principles, values are not law itself. Right? They have to be transformed into law, and that's where this engagement with power becomes more and more significant. Right? So it's in this context that the law reform process that Asmal initiated in Mandela's government that turned to these ideas of principle, and then tries to use those ideas both to reshape the law and to rely more on the idea of rights as a way to empower communities and others to make claims that are different to the existing or older legal claims to water. The significance of principles, as I said, was in the introduction of hydrological principles based on a scientific understanding of the water cycle, which enabled us to challenge the existing claims of legal rights. Once the basis of existing claims were undermined, principles enabled the construction of an alternative set of rights and processes for the allocation of water resources. But despite the success of principles in both deconstructing existing claims and even constructing new sets of rights, such as the creation of the reserve for the basic needs of people or to maintain the ecological function, it was within the context of the two other frames, both the institutional and the ideological, that's proven to be the weak links in water governance since the late 1990s. And if you think of those, that institutional, it's all about capacity and implementation, while the ideological, of course, is that tension between human rights and neoliberalism. First, within the ideological frame, the principles themselves provided space for both ambiguity and also contradictory approaches, that of human rights and neoliberalism. Among the participants in the process, there were different perspectives about whether these differences could be reconciled or if that they were simply contradictory. Assertions of efficiency, cost recovery were seen as by some as essential to sustainability, while others argued that sustainability was premised on the recognition of rights and the supply of water to those who had long been denied access. So within the principles themselves, you see these contradictions exist. Now, finally, the second, the institutional frame, would be in the long run prove to be the Achilles heel of this approach, since the constitutional allocation of authority meant that while management of national water resources was allocated to national government, the actual supply of water was institutionally situated within local governments. And while in the first 10 years of ANC government, we saw a dramatic expansion of access to water, the increased failure of local administration with corruption and state capture in South Africa has seen the degradation of both the physical and institutional structures for water distribution at the local level, compounded by extreme drought and climate change. It's in this infrastructural failure that's now undermining the very principles upon which post-apartheid water law reform was based. And I'll leave it at that and we can take it up in the conversation. Thank you very much.
Excellent, Heinz. Thank you so much for kicking us off and drawing our attention to the importance of principles, the importance of law, and the strategic ambiguity that you described. Now, we're now going to switch to Mucha Musemwa, who's also joining us from South Africa, who's going to be talking a bit about Zimbabwe. I had the pleasure and privilege of editing the special issue with Mucha, as well as with Alan Isaacman of the University of Minnesota. Mucha, by background, is a historian. So we've got a very interdisciplinary panel here for you today to look at these questions from various academic standpoints. Mucha is going to help us to think historically about some of these questions. Mucha, over to you. Fantastic to have you here with us.
Thanks very much, Harry, and thanks to everyone who is listening for just coming to listen to us as we speak. And greetings to Heinz. Seeing you in person, though virtually for the first time, and to Simukai, we have not met, but I'm sure we have read each other's works. So it's a pleasure to be on the same panel as you. So I will begin. My paper or essay, which is now published in Daedalus, is entitled Urban Struggles Over Water Scarcity in Harare. I want to begin by simply indicating that, and this is a point that I do not emphasize at all in the essay, But that is to say that most of you who know something about Zimbabwe, about its history, about contemporary struggles, will know something about the dominance of struggles over land. And so my paper has been really triggered by this feel that quite often when you look at the matter of ownership and access to land, what is lost in all the debates and policy adjustments has been the equally important questions of access to water in cities, especially Harare. Given that rural land reform, while critically important, is now well-trodden ground, and I am specifically talking about the Zimbabwean scenario here, and particularly its historiography, you do see that rural land reform is indeed well-trodden ground. I have come to think that it is time for us to begin to consider our own time and spaces with the benefit of history and to refocus from farming to the dominant mode of life in the 21st century Africa, urban rather than rural. The effects of lack of access to water and sanitary services are far more important in densely populated cities than in rural areas where the potential for accessing a source of water and dealing with waste are relatively higher. But you can also see that the historiography is shifting the spotlight onto matters of water. And this has obviously been a research interest of my own. Studying the urban environment as I see it might just help us rediscover certain historical problems and offer new research insights than simply focus on land. And so I highlight the work of Goran Thebon, who taps into this rich urban environmental vein and who knows that urban life is significantly structured by the availability, equity, and accessibility of a number of necessary urban services. But of course, as noted by Carol Rakodi and Leila Harris, Harris happens to be one of the contributors in this journal, even when water distribution infrastructure, that is pipes and taps, is provided, this is not a guarantee that water will always flow through them. This is a harsh reality most urban residents in Zimbabwe live with daily. Such deficiencies in service provision created political and socio-environmental struggles in many cities in the world. So I'm here trying to say that we shouldn't just think of Harare only, but these are things that kinds of struggles that continue to replicate themselves, whether it's Johannesburg or Lagos, and so on and so forth. Now, we couldn't talk about water without even reflecting a little bit on the current moment we are in, the COVID-19 pandemic, which has laid bare the historical inequalities among urban residents and the ill-preparedness of many states to provide even the most basic resource critical for the maintenance of the health and sanitization of their citizens. Needless to emphasize that Zimbabwe has been one such state. In any study, however, it is the human-water interactions that are significant. Scientists, hydrologists, for example, often deal with water as a natural resource alone. And Jamie Linton critiques this neglect very well. He says, human history has been critical to the nature of water. To talk about water without including its social and historical ingredients is to leave out a large part of the story. Water is never so pure as that. Now, turning to the argument I posit in my paper, the climate crisis, including droughts and floods, has exacerbated the need to research water in African cities. My essay is therefore a strong argument to include political and economic action in the debate, not only to lay blame, all blame, in fact, on climate change, such that by focusing on Harare, I reject the notion that climate change alone is responsible and contend that water crises must be understood within the contentious, long, and complex history of water politics in the capital city from the colonial to the post-colonial period, that is from 1890 to the present. Just a bit on colonial and post-colonial water histories. Where is the link, particularly in the Zimbabwean context? Although the colonial and post-colonial states in Zimbabwe had different ideological and racial policies, it is remarkable that at no time were there adequate supplies of water to the urban poor, even at times when water was abundant in the city's reservoirs. While the colonial government, until 1979, racialized access to water by restricting its use by urban Africans, the post-colonial government has failed to change the patterns of water distribution and did little to increase supplies as the population grew and the city expanded. For pre-colonial Africans, land and water were an inextricable and indivisible part of the landscape. Thus, it was that colonization, capitalism, and also post-colonial policies ruptured this relationship as access to water and land was reordered, controlled, and racialized. This led directly to historical and emerging social and political struggles over urban water and sanitation in Harare. To recognize the legacy of history is not to deny the effects of climate change, but to guard against creating a meta-narrative that would efface or submerge equally significant historical realities, such as poor governance, poor water governance for more than a century. Let me quickly jump to the inheritance of post-colonial Harare during so that when the new government in 1980, that of Robert Mugabe, takes over, and what happens? So soon after independence in 1980, Robert Mugabe's government inherits an unequal society, no question about that, in which access to critical natural resources have been determined by race, gender, geography, and other segregationist measures. Water in Harare was distributed along the lines of race, but also places of residence. Successive colonial governments used water allocation within the city as a means to segregate whites and Africans. Spatial planning ensured that water supply distribution networks and patterns would manifest the relations between colonizer and colonized. Although Mugabe's government inherited a solid urban water supply system in Harare, the infrastructure was primarily designed to serve whites, while Africans were restricted to segregated and overcrowded townships, received limited amounts of water and sanitation services in terms of the law. Rectifying this imbalance was a formidable challenge to independent Zimbabwe. So despite many empty promises today, 4 decades after independence, the inherited unequal distribution patterns of water and sanitation remain deeply entrenched. Indeed, the city's water infrastructure has deteriorated, resulting in water shortages and poor water quality, and even causing disease, such as the 2008 and 2018 cholera outbreaks. From the early 2000s, press reports such as typhoid spreads amid water shortage, or Zimbabwe untreated sewage makes its way into drinking water have been common. While such headlines may appear sensational, the realities in Harare's high-density townships confirm the extent to which the twin problems of water scarcity and poor sanitation are a lived reality. The water scarcity problems that residents of Harare experience are the legacy of a 2-decades-old water crisis, which has less to do with climate change than the range of anthropogenic factors that have undermined the successful provision of water by both the central government and the local urban authority. Harry, how much time do I have?
If you could wrap it up in a minute or two, that would be fantastic.
All right. So indeed, this chapter, given the nature of historical narrative, is quite a long chapter. And what I try to give you, indeed, simply the tidbits of what this essay is about. And so what I want to do is to simply jump to the kinds of conclusions that I make, and then maybe come back to some specifics if needs be, as I respond to questions. So I've just given you a sense of the kind of the historical setting, right, which was highly colonial, racialized access to water, incomes, the ZANU-PF government, and how it actually failed to maintain the water infrastructure that it inherited, an infrastructure that was quite solid. But then in my conclusion, this is what I say. I pose the question, why did the post-colonial Zimbabwe government, with its commitment to liberation from colonial oppression and the radical transformation of lives for the better, fail in its endeavors? One of the planks of a better life was to improve access to water, and government document after document, and its own commitments to United Nations water and sanitation principles. That kind of literature is abundant, but it fails. So while the colonial policy of racial segregation led to differential, regulated, and inadequate access to water for Africans in colonial Harare, an array of interacting factors has hampered the fulfillment of its water objectives. In its first 20 years in power, the ZANU-PF government gave little attention to the urban population increase and failed to appreciate the importance of augmenting water supplies and repairing or introducing new water infrastructure for this growing city. Then the government began to face myriad political and economic crises, which curtailed any financial resources to repair, maintain, and guarantee regular water flows to the residents of Harare. Consequently, the neglect of urban areas proved to be short-sighted and later on came back to haunt the state. An economic structural adjustment program that was introduced between 1990 and 1995, instead of opening up the economy to market forces, actually shrank the economy. Whereas the state had been supporting residents with low-cost urban water supplies, the ISAP, as it is often called, obliged the state to treat it as a saleable commodity, thus treating water as a commodity. But what followed was the cataclysmic decline of the Zimbabwe economy. This, with the decline of the Zimbabwe dollar and military engagements, particularly in the DRC, meant that after 2000, the economy spiraled rapidly into a world record decline. The government simply lacked the foreign currency to acquire even basic water purification chemicals for the city. The contentious politics between ZANU-PF and the MDC also contributed to the water crisis in Harare and the ruling party's failure to provide water to the urban residents. All in all, as the ruling party's political fortunes and hopes to win back urban voters progressively waned, its interest in ever resolving their genuine grievances around water and sanitation simply diminished as it employed tactics that alienated it from the people rather than endeared it to them. Herein lies the ZANU-PF government's complete failure to provide water for its urban people. And now to my last two sentences. And I cannot, as a historian, not declare the following, that history in general matters, but water history in particular matters even more. It matters because while Harare's water crisis is emblematic of challenges plaguing cities such as Bulawayo, Cape Town, Lilongwe, Nairobi, Kinshasa, you name them, and many more around the world, questions around the contemporary water scarcities across the globe have tended to focus more on the nature of the problem rather than its historical origins. We will do well to recognize, as the case of Harare reminds us, that water is a historical item linking the past to the present and the future of our cities. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Mucha, for that historical perspective, and also the point, I think, which is extremely important in discussions about climate change and energy transitions, etc. That climate is a very important driver in changing human behavior, but it's not the only one. And sometimes, of course, our preoccupation with focusing on the present moment, and especially on the impacts of climate change, may well veil some of the very important, as you said, drivers, especially of inequalities, lack of access, exclusion, deliberate exclusion even, of people. So I think that was an extremely pertinent point you made, and one very well taken. Let me now invite Kate, Dr. Kate Brown, University of the Western Cape, to share her thoughts. She also wrote an essay together with Jackie King in our special issue, and we're very pleased to have her with us here today. I think, Kate, you're also going to share a presentation, so over to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, I'm Harry. Can I just ask you if you can see my screen?
I can, and I suspect our viewers, our listeners can as well.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And thank you to the people that preceded me. It was extremely interesting. I'm going to talk around an article in the same Daedalus that was co-authored by a colleague of mine, Dr. Jackie King, and myself, entitled African Living Rivers, Management for Sustainability, and with a focus on hydropower and how that might interlink with rivers and river sustainability. And if we're talking about Africa's living rivers, we're talking essentially about flows of and for life. These are in the context of climate change, carbon sinks and temperature moderators. They provide protection against flooding. They're also amongst the most biodiverse systems on Earth, and of fundamental support to people. And I'll touch on that in a second with some examples. They are, as ecosystems, integrated and connected with longitudinal lateral links, primarily to the main drivers of flow, sediment, and water quality regimes. And these interactions are complex with a multitude of feedback loops, which makes it quite difficult to understand very quickly how a system may respond to any kind of intervention, particularly something like an in-channel hydropower dam. They're also extremely vulnerable, partly because they transverse and drain vast landscapes. And the map that I had up earlier was a color picture of the basins in Africa. So these are vast landscapes that single basins drain, and are subject to a myriad of different impacts, therefore making them the most threatened and fast declining ecosystems in the world. And if we talk a little bit about the fundamental support of these systems to people, I'm just going to pick on an example, and this one is inland fisheries. And the map in front of you just gives an idea of the reliance on inland fisheries for protein production across the globe. And those colors that are red and yellow and green and beige show the areas that have the highest reliance. And just sweeping across the colors, one can see that Africa has a tremendous reliance on, for example, inland fisheries. There's other aspects of rivers that we could highlight. But in many cases, inland fisheries are providing up to 20% of the protein that's consumed by rural people, and indeed many urban people in the African setting. And not unsurprisingly, many of these fisheries are under pressure from overharvesting. Now, one of the things about fisheries production is that they are very closely linked to the flow regimes of rivers and the sediment and the water quality. But I'm again just picking up an example, and just to highlight two aspects of a flow regime that contribute towards fisheries productivity. I've got a stylized diagram here just of the seasonal fluctuation and flows going from the low season, the rain starting, the flood season coming and dropping back to the low season. And just two aspects of that, the start of the season, the timing of the start of the season, linking in with ambient temperature, linking in with when eggs start to form in the female fishes, and then the reproductive triggers to migrate to either to flooded floodplains or upstream to spawn. So absolutely intricately linked. If there's a failure in these, there's a failure in fisheries productivity. Also, the higher flows in the wet season, maintaining key habitats, for example, washing sediments off gravel beds that are the preferred spawning area for many of these fishes on which people rely for their livelihoods. And of course, this kind of flow regime is incredibly vulnerable to disruption from water resource development. So I've touched on two of the main impacts on rivers in Southern Africa and Africa in general. And the third one that I'd like to touch on, mainly because of its relevance to the argument that I have around hydropower production, is deforestation and sedimentation of rivers. And again, there's a map showing the areas in orange and red where there has been a denusion of the woody vegetation in river catchments. This is linked partly in places to urbanization, partly to clearing areas for crops. But the main reason for this deforestation is the need for energy. Any place that you go to, driving around in the rural areas of Africa, virtually every lay-by has people selling charcoal that has come from the woody vegetation. Of course, when you take woody vegetation out of the landscape, the rainfall that falls picks up additional sediment that is washed down into the rivers. It exceeds the carrying capacity of those rivers, and so it settles out, taking us back to the fish. That degrades fish habitat, it fills in pools, it coats gravel spawning beds, and so on and so forth. So that too affects something like the productivity of fisheries and the biodiversity of the areas. So what then of hydropower? It's widely seen as a primary renewable resource in Africa. There's currently just upward of 38 gigawatts of installed capacity in Africa in general. And the technical potential is huge. It's around 1,700 terawatts. And from a perspective of somebody who's spent most of her working life in the ecosocial space of rivers in Africa, I'm forced to, oopsie, I pressed the wrong button. I'm forced to ask myself whether this is a blessing or a curse. The fact that we have so much unrealized potential for hydropower in Africa. And I just want to talk to that a little bit as we move forward. I think that the impacts of hydropower on natural drivers of river condition are probably fairly well understood by this audience. But just to recap, they're primarily around the changing of the seasonal and daily patterns of the flow of water, the flow of sediment and the type of sediment that is available in rivers, and water quality, chief amongst those being temperature. And then the other aspect that garners great publicity and interest is the longitudinal connectivity, the blockage of the movement of animals and plants upstream and downstream on river channels. Less highlighted is the lateral movement, the reduction of flooding of floodplains as a result of flattening out the seasonal pattern and reducing the availability of floodplains to animals and people. And just by way of example, the blue line here is a natural hydrograph of a river, and the yellow line is after a hydropower plant has gone in. And if we hark back to that stylized diagram I put up a little bit earlier, we end up with the start of the seasons being considerably delayed. So fish are ready to spawn, but flow conditions are not right for that spawning. Key habitats are not maintained because we don't have the shear stress in the wet season to flush out sediments, or else we have too many sediments. And the seasons, particularly the wet season, typically is shortened considerably, leaving insufficient time to spawn, hatch, and develop. And remember that we're not just talking about fish here. These are fish that are then caught by people, eaten by people. So there's that whole ecosocial link to the flow regimes. And of course, the extent of these kind of impacts are greatly influenced in hydropower and in other dams, and indeed in all development by location, design, and operation, which in itself offers an opportunity to do things better than they have been done necessarily in the past. And in order to do things better, we need to have some idea and some means of predicting how these systems will react to the kinds of developments that we are contemplating putting on them, hydropower being the example of the moment. In Southern Africa, there's been more than 30 years of investment by the governments of the area, by funders, international funders and donors, in tools to guide and provide this sort of information. And I'm going to highlight one particular tool, as the one that we highlighted in the paper. But there are several others that have been made available to provide the information needed to guide the mitigation of impacts of water resource developments on rivers, wetlands, and estuaries, and on the people that rely on them. The reason that it's important that they've been developed in the continent is that they've been developed within the constraints of the kind of scientific conditions that occur here. And amongst those are a dearth of empirical data, a huge reliance on the systems by people. And by and large, these are ecosocial approaches using the best available knowledge. Many have been very widely applied and tested. And so what I want to do is just go for a second through what do I mean by this, and how do we approach this problem to try and assist on what the likely implications are for development, to try then aid in mitigation of those, or better planning or better design of developments and operation thereof. And so what these river-linked tools try to do is they, first of all, identify the important aspects of a river ecosystem. And in this particular example, it's river catch. Then identify what is making up that. So if it's a fishery, what are the main species or the main builds that are making up that fishery? For each one of those, what are their main life history requirements in terms of habitats, water quality, seasonal patterns of flow availability, whether they eat aquatic insects or algae, and connectivity, where do they need to move to in order to spawn? And then for each one of those, breaking them down further into the drivers that are likely to be affected by water resource development, and in this case, hydropower in particular. And I've used the example, one of the key habitats for fish, and I've highlighted this already, is gravel beds. They will respond to many things, of which 4 main ones are the dry season discharge, whether they are in fact flooded or not, in other words, available to a fish. The wet season discharge or shear stress, the ability of the wet season flows to move sediment, the duration of the time during which they can move that sediment, and the volume and type of sediment that is entering the system. So for each of those, we're able, through studies from students, through international literature, through experience from elsewhere in the world, to develop relationships for each and every one of those on how, if you change, for example, dry season discharge, how might that affect gravel beds? And then, of course, not to forget the feedback loop of people using a fishery and they themselves having an impact on that fishery. And I mentioned overharvesting when I first started the presentation. So if you build this up for all of the valued parts of a river ecosystem, what you would end up with is something that looks like this. And I've taken an example of one of the drift models from the Okavango Basin. And it's basically an ecosocial model that captures the best availability on the river links and the relationships that drive those river links. So I started off by saying that these are vulnerable and complex systems. And what we have tried to do in Southern Africa is build these kinds of models for our major rivers. They've been built for the Zambezi, for the Okavango, for the Kafue, for many, the Olifants, the Orange, to try and give us some handle on how they're likely to respond so that we can hone how we might want to develop those rivers. The idea being that if we want sustainable development going into the future, we need to move beyond just the way that a lot of water resource development is assessed, particularly when it's aimed at supplying something to a nearby city. And that's primarily around the production of food, mass production of food, and mass production of energy, and the cost, the unit cost of producing each of those. What we're trying to do in the basins in Southern Africa, and being led primarily by the Okavango Basin, is to bring in the other aspects of sustainable development, those of social justice, access to safe energy, sanitation, hygiene, drinking water, employment, gender equality, and those of ecological integrity and the support that that provides through terrestrial health, aquatic health, groundwater health, and biodiversity. And then, of course, adding in other aspects of the economics, such as management and equity. So to come back to the question of whether hydropower development in particular may be a blessing or a curse in Southern Africa and Africa in general, somewhat unsurprisingly, I'm not going to answer my own question, but what I am going to do is say that the blessing part of that would be considerably enhanced by using the available ecosocial tools to assess the impact at a basin scale, because that is the scale at which rivers operate, by targeting social justice and equity. And part of that, in my mind, when I say that, is this idea around one of the major problems that we've got is deforestation. That is linked to energy. And yet, in at least 4 of the hydropower plants that I'm involved with at the moment on the subcontinent, the electricity is being generated rurally and all being taken to urban centers, none of which is being distributed to the people in the areas where the hydropower plants are being built. Notwithstanding the fact that the very sediment that comes from that habitat degradation ends up in the hydropower plants and becomes a cost. So there's a great opportunity, I think, to alleviate some of the existing impacts. And then the other thing that I think is necessary, or in terms of whether it's a blessing or a curse, is to set some a priori limits to ecosystem degradation. Appreciate what the ecosystem is doing, particularly for rural populations, but for all people in the region, and set limits to ecosystem degradation within which design, operation, and location can be fine-tuned to keep that level of degradation. And of course, then adequate financing for basin management. Thank you very much. I hope I've captured the essence of what was in our article. Thank you.
That was tremendous, Kate. Again, a very different perspective on some of the same questions we've been wrestling with, but that was terrific. Thank you so much. And last but not least, let me now turn it over to my comrade Simukai Chigudu of the Oxford Department of International Development. Simukai did not write, unfortunately, in our special issue, but he's of course a very noted critical scholar of global health and indeed questions around water insecurity and the lived experiences by ordinary people in Southern Africa. So Simukai, over to you for your thoughts here on the discussion. Thank you so much for being with us.
Great, thanks very much, Henry. And thank you to all the presenters. I mean, that was just such a fascinating and powerfully complementary set of papers that we've just been given a glimpse of. And they're of course part of a wider collection in the special issue. It's intensely thought-provoking. So I guess I'll be relatively brief. I wanted to try to organize my response to the papers by thinking about some of the common threads that I see running through them. And I'm going to highlight kind of three key lines of inquiry, perhaps, and then maybe make a meta point at the end. So my 3 points, the first is about the importance of history, but also of path dependency. So I think both in Heinz and Mucha's papers, for instance, we were given quite a compelling account of the role that colonial history plays in shaping histories of material deprivation and of dispossession. But in the process, new kinds of social categories are created. So we have, of course, the reification or the construction of race and of racial inequality that's then mapped onto different configurations of class structures. But the path dependency here becomes quite important because after, for instance, as Mucha describes, Zimbabwe's emergence from colonial rule under the Rhodesian state, we see a kind of manifest failure in reorienting or really breaking down the models of dispossession that had been grafted onto race in urban areas. So, okay, yes, the city kind of deracializes insofar as past laws are removed, legislative limits around where people can, formally live or where they're allowed to live are removed. And there is some kind of attempt to diminish the forms of racial strife that existed in the old regime. And yet materially, how much does this change? And I think that this points at something slightly deeper, which is to say that not only is there an inheritance of this sort of structural inequality from colonial rule and forms of material deprivation and dispossession, but an inheritance of ideas about how the body politic is structured, who belongs and who doesn't belong. And I want to suggest here, perhaps building from my own research and bridging it back into what Mucha is saying, I'm going to call it a kind of ironic vision of political modernity. So what we have, for instance, in Harare, is a view that Harare is the Sunshine City, that parts of the city that under colonial rule were largely kind of white-owned areas that really looked like kind of countrified suburbias. And then in its peripheries, urban agglomerations or townships that are inhabited historically by Black labor migrants. Those have gone from being a kind of pool or a reservoir for white-owned commerce and business, but to being a drain, or seen by the government as a drain on the economy, as hotspots for opposition protest. And so the continuity is that there are forms of urban order and urban disorder that are reimagined from the prism of race under the Rhodesians into the post-colonial government into kind of partisan lines. And so I think that there's something kind of profound of this co-constitution of both the material and the ideational and how they're mapped onto human beings. And I think that kind of bridges into my second kind of category of observation, which is about this kind of relationship between law and citizenship. So Heinz, I was really struck by your I think beautiful articulation of this idea of principle and of the kinds of principles put into place to guide South Africa's transition out of apartheid and the struggles, the lawfare, if you like, to have these principles translated into the Constitution and to guide legislation and institutions. And yet we see rubbing up again and again the difficulties of translating this now into everyday life. And there is a kind of burgeoning body of literature, a lot of it within anthropology, that starts to think about what citizenship means beyond its kind of legal and juridical parameters. So is citizenship meaningful if only confined, for instance, to the right to vote? But what if Black majority rule does not translate to citizenship as indexed by access to, say, material goods? So citizenship in this kind of more substantive sense. And so I'm thinking here of scholars like Nikhil Anand, Indian anthropologist who studies the politics of water in Mumbai, and his move to think about what he calls hydraulic citizenship. In other words, citizens claim their rights to belong in the city and their belonging into the wider body politic per se, according to this kind of fraught and intermittent and iterative relationship they have to the physical infrastructures that make up the conditions of daily life. And in Nikhil Anand's notion of hydraulic citizenship is kind of a microcosm of something that Mucha had suggested, which is that when we look at urban life, the conditions for sustaining it, for allowing it to thrive, often relate to the ability to provide public services. So we're seeing here, through the prism of water, through the prism of hydraulic infrastructure, the kind of shifting relationship between a state and its citizens, and our kind of normative ideas of the good, and how they brush up against the limits of the law and of the principles to actually achieve societal transformation. But that takes me then to think about another kind of citizenship that I think looms at the background of this discussion. So Heinz, you had mentioned the ideological clash vis-a-vis sustainable water supply, where we have on the one hand a rights-based approach, that sustainable, access or use of water, is best realized through the prism of human rights. And on the other hand, what you labeled a kind of neoliberal approach. So thinking a lot about economic efficiency, various costing measures, and so on, to manage sustainability, in a sense, both environmentally and economically. And so I think at the convergence here, we have, in a sense, the emergence of a neoliberal citizen. So the literature that looks at this considers neoliberalism as not only changing our economics, but changing our politics, changing how citizens come to understand themselves and the problems that they face. So, for instance, where the state struggles to deliver in a consistent and regularized way public services on a kind of material basis, citizens are left to creatively fend for themselves, to survive or to move from one crisis to another, at times at the aid of things like NGOs or humanitarian groups, so Oxfam, Water Aid, and so on. And so there's this interesting kind of configuration that's happening in post-colonial Africa about the changing nature of public services and welfare, and the contested and governing ideology of neoliberalism that's at play. Ironically enough, I actually don't think South Africa is maybe the best example of this at all, but it's certainly true in other parts of the continent. But this idea of moving from one crisis to the next makes me think of the third frame, or the third thread that I want to highlight, which I'm going to call hydrological uncertainty. So if we think, in the sense of deep time, I think humanity coming to recognize that we live and inhabit a geological epoch of our own making, the Anthropocene, and we have left through our relentless pursuit for growth and capitalist development an appreciable mark on the Earth's systems. But the Anthropocene is a large and at times unwieldy concept, and hence competing frames to try to define, who within humanity is responsible for the Anthropocene. So scholars increasingly talking about the Capitalocene to show that really it's the industrialization of the Western world that, bears the brunt for the transformation of our environment. And at the same time, I think what this shows us is the perils of meta-narratives when it comes to hydrological uncertainty. As Mucha suggested, there is a danger in trying to interpret water scarcity issues in Harare, purely through the prism of climate change. And so that, demands that we hold some complex ideas in place, that we recognize the Anthropocene or the Capitalocene, we recognize climate change as facts. And at the same time, we don't draw linear or deterministic lines that efface history and politics to say, because of this environmental change, we necessarily now see water scarcity. Because of water scarcity, we might now see, say, conflict or whatever the case might be. Water scarcity in an important sense then is itself a social construct. It exists within a cultural matrix that animates our thinking about our relationship or the relationship between humans and water. And I think that bridges nicely then into Kate's paper, where we're seeing hydrological uncertainty kind of mapped onto the biosphere and questions of biodiversity, and through this kind of prism of the eco-social. And I think this is really the place of interdisciplinary scholarship and kind of what excites me about this collection, because Kate, your contribution invites us to think seriously and rigorously about the environmental science that underpins, say, for instance, the relationship between fisheries and rivers, and how that then feeds into our political, legal, and civic spheres. I couldn't help but think about my own work on the politics of epidemics. And an argument that I have been making for some time now and continuing to develop about the nature of human microbial relationships is to move away from an old idea that there was some kind of teleology in how epidemiology evolves over time, where in societies at lower levels of development or industrialization are, primarily afflicted by diseases of poverty, malnutrition, childhood infections, and gradually kind of graduate to longer life expectancy, low fertility, and non-communicable disease as the kind of prevailing parts of the epidemiological profile. And instead saying that, we don't quite eliminate microbes from human life or human existence. They find ways of recurring, reinventing themselves. And there is a kind of iterative relationship between humans and microbes, often mediated by the environment. COVID-19, of course, has proven this beyond all doubt. And I guess the parallel I'm drawing here between my kind of biosocial mode of analysis is this kind of iterative relationship to the ecosocial. So with all of that said, I guess questions and a final reflection. To Kate, I guess I'd want to know a little bit more about some of the contradictions in thinking through the very notion of sustainable development. Is that an oxymoronic term? Can development be sustainable? And is there a particular direction of travel here, a kind of telos that we need to be thinking or wrestling with? Or are we subject to kind of iterative cycles of just managing the paradox of our ecosystem? Tumucha, I guess I'd want to push you a little bit more on trying to understand some of the failures of the post-colonial government in dealing or managing the urban environment. I know that you've given us a kind of historical analysis of structural adjustment and the makings of the Zimbabwe crisis, our intervention in the war in the Congo, land reform, etc. But I wonder, at an ideational level, what are the kinds of visions, understandings of the urban that have led to its neglect by the ZANU-PF government? To Heinz, I kind of going back, I think, to the ideological tension between rights-based approaches and neoliberalism. If, as many people contend, neoliberalism is the governing ideology of our age, is a rights-based approach to these questions doomed? And then my kind of meta-reflection is, I think this panel is a wonderful illustration of what Jean and John Komaroff posited as theory from the South. An opportunity to think not only empirically about the struggles that are happening within Southern Africa, but to use it as a basis for producing social theory about some of the large questions that face humanity. All right, so Harry, I'll hand back to you and we can open up for wider discussion.
Terrific, Simkhai. Thank you so much for sharing those three critical threads, as you termed them, throughout the idea of path dependency, importance of history, citizenship, and water. Water as a lens to really understand the way people belong or see themselves as belonging. And as you said, this question of the levels of analysis through this prism of hydrological uncertainty, the global versus the local, and indeed very much speaking to Kate's points, in the sense that all of these questions are profoundly local, both in how they affect people, but also very importantly in how we understand cause and effect relations. So Thank you so much for that. I think that they're all very, very, very well taken. Now, other than the questions you've posed to some of our panelists, questions in the chat as well I'd like to share. There's a number of questions that touch very much on the question of the energy transition and moving away from fossil fuels and how that will affect in the Southern African context, struggles over water, experiences of water and water insecurity. To the extent you have any thoughts, Mucha, Heinz, and Kate, that would be very much appreciated. Secondly, I also spotted a question about the idea of planning and state capacity. I mean, clearly states have recurrently failed, as we've pointed out here, their colonial as well as their post-colonial guises, their own people. Nonetheless, is there an argument to be made for increased state capacity, for greater reach, for a greater understanding, as Kate seemed to suggest? Or is that, again, turning back to Simu's point, a bit of an oxymoron? Is that an inherently oppressive prospect? Is it very difficult to imagine more equitable and inclusive access to energy and indeed to water in the current political configuration, the current institutional configuration? What kind of change is actually possible there is also one of the questions that's emerging. So let's perhaps take those in the order that we've had the speakers present. So perhaps Heinz, we come to you first, and then Mucha, and then Kate. And meanwhile, if you have any other questions, please share them in the chat. We're most interested in hearing from you.
Great, Harry, thank you very much. And thank you very much to Simukai. That was absolutely fabulous in terms of the stimulation of the ideas. It's really interesting, this ideological tension between neoliberalism and a rights-based approach, which you've asked me to talk about. What's significant about that is at least for at this moment in time, I would argue that neoliberalism may have been a dominant position, but it is now really in tatters, right? It's really under question, and it's not clear whether it can actually survive this particular moment, both because of COVID, but actually pre-COVID already it was falling apart. And of course, that doesn't mean that the rights-based approach is immediately an answer or success. And I can describe this briefly in the context of, if you think of that post-apartheid moment and the new constitution, and all the way down to the local level, the very notion that local government would be driven by a form of local citizenship premised in what were called ward committees at the local level in local government. That's how developmental ideas were supposed to come forward. And in that very initial period, there was a dramatic expansion of access to water. So hydrological citizenship made a great lot of sense at that moment, at that very moment. But if you take it from that bottom level up, what we saw very quickly was because of the lack of state capacity at that local level, those ward committees were soon dominated by local elites or emerging elites who were interested in using this as a way to gain access to resources, and not resources for citizenship, but resources for individual gain. And so what you see, it's at that area, at that very local level, where the first indications of the power of corruption, access to government contracts, etc., become key, and in fact have become a very destructive part of what has happened in South Africa. So that takes you to that question of the argument for increased state capacity. I actually think it is important to increase state capacity, the capacity to actually govern. Because what corruption that has actually done is destroy state capacity, which in fact empowers a kind of neoliberal approach, which says it's all about the individual. It's all about what you can gain access to and retain access to versus others. The kind of idea that neoliberalism would produce efficiency, it would produce access, etc., has just not panned out in any way at the local level in South Africa, and I would say elsewhere as well. But that's my couple of cents, and I'd be interested in what others have to say. But again, thank you very much, really interesting.
Terrific, guys, thank you so much. Mucha, over to you.
Thanks. Thanks, Ed. And to Simukai, thank you so much for the manner in which you framed the three presentations. I thought that was very insightful. In fact, you left me with a number of issues to actually ponder over beyond this presentation. So if I could jump straight to to your question, when you were posing the question, how do we begin to understand some of the failures of the Zimbabwean state and the kinds of visions that have led to these failures, even their understanding of how they are governed. The behavior of the ZANU-PF, controlled state, boils down to a period when ZANU-PF, for the first 10 years of independence, 1980 to 1990, and you would be aware of this, was indeed a very, popular party, winning all manner of elections, and come like in the 1990s, you saw ZANU-PF beginning to lose political control. And it does so in very expressive ways, losing almost all urban councils to the new opposition party. And so the moment that happens, it feels like, it has to really, there's a word I'm looking for, but it just can't come to mind. But it goes on a punitive, violent, it actually uses violence against the opposition to regain political power. But people in the urban areas, particularly Harare, Bulawayo, and all the others, are fed up of ZANU-PF because nothing is changing. And ZANU-PF begins to use water as a mechanism of social control. And we've seen this actually in other places. But the ZANU-PF one is so vindictive such that it seizes, takes over water infrastructure, stops municipal councils who were actually benefiting from water revenues to develop schools, to develop clinics. All that comes to naught. So in terms of the renewal of infrastructure, that ceases to happen because the ZANU-PF is a government. It actually privileges politics, puts politics above everything else. And so what is actually making life difficult for many citizens is this punitive behavior of ZANU-PF, that because it wants to dislodge the opposition party by any means necessary. But the urban residents, you can talk of those who live in the north, the elite. You can talk of the marginalized, those who live in townships where water trickles almost always. They are united on one thing, that they will never vote ZANU-PF back in power. Why? Because of the corruption and also the particularly corruption is actually at the center of its failure to provide the requisite services that would be required for water development for the entire Robert Mugabe era. And this was the issue. To a point where you would know as well that there was a whole minister, the Minister of Urban Local Government, whose mission it became to simply discipline mayors of the opposition party. But he was not meant to look at the whole, holistically at what urban governance actually means, and whether to even reflect on whether they are in fact providing the kind of laws and governance ensuring that resources are directed to the people that should get them. That ceases to happen. So, but one also wants to say that I wanted to go back rather to tie this this point to, I think, was it, I can't remember the name. Someone told, is it Wanji? I need to look at that question by, sorry, by Wanja. Yes.
Wanja, yeah, Wanja.
Yes, Wanja, who was asking along the same lines, and that there's a need for change by current governments. I mean, I think there was an acknowledgement made in that statement that what solutions are most suitable. We already know what the problems are, right? Yes, perhaps Wanja, you and I and everyone else listening here may know what the problems are. But it has never been evident to me that when politicians are appointed to their positions, councillors in local government do understand how far these problems have come. I mean, I often tend to think that these guys don't read. They don't read the well-researched literature to begin to understand and appreciate how far these problems have come. And that's why when you look at history, you see that there has been a continued replication of the same kinds of problems. Now they come in, what are they trying to solve? They don't even understand. And so we know the problems, but corruption suddenly steps in and it becomes, it actually rules the roost. And so what the major, one of the major solutions is actually investment, right? But investment has to be looked at it, in a much broader sense. I mean, where do you get the investment when there's so much, when the whole system from the national government down to urban governance is riddled with corruption? And so that for me would be the first thing to do, is to root out corruption. Then there was Tom Broadbent who made the point about what, sorry, I want to go back to that point. Is this really colonialism or a guise for ongoing corruption, control, and limited equity? And I'm hoping that when I was trying to trace the roots of the Zimbabwean contemporary water crisis, I wasn't suggesting that colonialism is to blame. Certainly not. But that's the language in the discourses of politicians. That's the language that they use. That everything is blamed on colonialism. Well, colonialism does become indeed a guise for ongoing corruption. It's not that the money is not there, right? It's also not that the water is not abundant, but as we all know, it's how the water is distributed or not distributed, to whom it is distributed or to whom it is not distributed. I think those are the questions that really should really occupy us. And so it's certainly not that colonialism is to blame for all these ills, but the striking continuation of the same kinds of patterns of exclusion, of, Simo was talking about, hydrological citizenship, which I think is a phrase that I really like, because you begin to think about multiple forms of citizenship, who belongs to the city, who doesn't. And some of these kinds of behaviors from politicians make it well nigh impossible for people to really feel that they are part of the city, because they can't get the kinds of services that in fact make them fuller citizens and to feel a sense of belonging to these cities. So I'll stop there and perhaps come back, and I hope, Simo, I've tried to respond to your question in a reasonable way. Yeah.
Terrific, Mucha. Thank you so much. Not the last words on this topic, I suspect either. Kate, could please join us as well for some of the questions and observations directed your way.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. And Sumakai, I like the others, thoroughly enjoyed your summation. I hope to touch on some aspects that made me think as I go through. I think one of the questions you asked at the end of your summation was whether we believe sustainable development is possible. So let me just start by saying that I firmly believe that sustainable development is scientifically and technologically possible. And as I mentioned when I was talking, in order for that to happen, it does require a multidisciplinary consideration of much wider disciplines than are currently the norm for consideration. And I take cognizance of some of the questions around the criteria required by lenders and some lenders not requiring quite as much hoops to be jumped through. What happens at the moment with a lot of the development that's happening is that the environmental and social sides are seen as tick box exercises, whereas the engineering side, and indeed not even the hydrological side, just the engineering side is seen as the real work. I believe that the real work is in meshing all of those and understanding the context in which you are placing a development, and the challenge to developers, to engineers, to everybody is to see where the bars are set and then jump over them. Use some innovation. We are using designs that are ages old and expecting a different outcome from an environmental perspective, or else we've just got our hands on our heads and saying, well, there's nothing we can do. When we develop our rivers, we mess up the environment and this affects rural people badly. There's nothing we can do about it. I completely fundamentally disagree with that. I think that there are things that can be done, and I think it's laziness not to do them. I do acknowledge, and this was widely acknowledged by both Heinz and Mucha, which is that the political and the administrative side it's above my pay grade. I'm afraid I am concentrating on.
Perhaps below it rather than above it, but anyway.
But I fully agree and acknowledge that is where the problems lie, and I'm very glad that certainly the other speakers here are challenging this and questioning this academically. It gives me great faith. One of the questions was asked, how wide is this spread? And I can speak specifically to Southern Africa and to SADC in general. And what I would like to say, rather than answer the question directly, well, let me answer it directly. It's spread fairly widely amongst basin organizations. It has been adopted in the law in the countries of most of the members of SADC. Most of the laws have been adopted. All of those countries are signatories to things like the Biodiversity Convention, like the Sustainable Development Goals. They're all signatories to that, and I acknowledge the signatories to that. Some of the transboundary agreements that are in place in Southern Africa are amongst the finest in the world, particularly with respect to their consideration of social rights and ecological rights and the intermeshing of those two things. So I do think it's fairly spread, and I do think that there is a push, particularly, and I'd like to highlight the Okavango Basin. I've had a lot of recent involvement there, and I would like to acknowledge that it's very much the basin organization, OCACOM. So it's not the individual governments, that's one step further on, but OCACOM's role is to advise those governments. And this basin that does not have a single major dam on it as we speak, has all sorts of proposals for inter alia hydropower, but also fracking and a whole lot of other things. Has developed a basin plan, developed the tools in order to assess a wide range of criteria, and are now in the process of starting to look for agreement amongst the three countries on what the limits would be. So what the limits would be for social improvement, what the limits would be for environmental degradation or no degradation allowed over the different parts of the basin, acknowledging the different histories in each of those parts of the basin. So I do think it's spreading. I don't think it's spreading anywhere near fast enough. And I do think that hydropower development per se, but particularly hydropower development, could be a very, very good thing for the subcontinent and for the continent as a whole, but only if it's contextualized and only if it is done with due consideration of the hoops that have to be jumped over. I've been involved in several hydropower projects where the engineers and the developers, particularly in the case that I'm thinking of here, Zimbabwe and Zambia, were quite amenable to how they might change the design and operation of a particular hydropower scheme to try and meet some of these levels. So I do think that there is some of that. And it does, we need it. The pressures at the moment on the environment are extreme. If I think of Malawi, the fisheries are collapsing. There's massive deforestation. We've had a change in the national boundaries as a result of the sedimentation of rivers, blocking a river and moving its course. And so that it used to form the border between Mozambique and Malawi, and it no longer does. So these kind of environmental degradation things are starting to have political implications beyond what I think was originally envisaged when people were talking about environmental degradation. And like in closing, just to wrap back around to what Sumakai was saying about microbes, because we use the example of pests in most of what we do. I think we're talking the similar sort of things. Our understanding of the natural controls that keep our Earth safe is extremely limited. And we understand that we've changed it. In some instances, we've been able to make it come back. But if COVID and diseases and the sort of things that you were talking about, Sumakai, have taught us anything, it's that we need to protect the natural balances that are in place. And at the very least, if we're going to destroy them, to understand what the implications of that might be to the best of our ability. Thank you very much.
Some very, I think, pertinent words to conclude here. Thank you so much to all of you. I think this was an exceptionally rich and interesting discussion. For those of us, of course, very much interested in Southern Africa, but I think also well beyond the implications from an ecosystems approach, historical approach, legal, institutional, and even at the end, Sumakai raising a number of anthropological reflections, I think extremely valuable, extremely worthwhile. So thank you so much for that. To our audience members, please check out the special issue of Daedalus, water security in Africa in the age of global climate change. The link was in the chat. I do hope you get a chance to read some of the contributions by various authors, not all of whom are, of course, present here today. Let me also flag next event in the same series that's going to be held on February 3rd, where we'll be taking a look from various vantage points at the energy transition and decarbonization and industrial policy in Africa and in Latin America. It's on February 3rd. Keep an eye out for advertisement and announcements around that. And then finally, let me thank you once again, all the speakers and audience members for being here. I very much enjoyed it. I hope you did too, and hope to see you all soon, virtually and hopefully as well in person. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Harry.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Harry.